Confessions of a Deep Sea Diver. I recently left my job as a deep sea diver. I worked for a large, reputable company that provides a wide range of underwater services. Everything from salvage and underwater demolition to ship repairs and search and recovery. They're known for being reliable and safe, to the point that they frequently receive government contracts. Honestly, I'll miss working there. The people I worked alongside were truly the best in the business. But after a while, there are only so many unexplainable things you can witness in the deep before you decide it's time to stay on land for good. These are the kinds of secrets many divers carry with them to their graves. One time, while en route to a job we had been contracted for, our ship's propeller became fouled. I suited up and got ready for a quick dive to clear it. After a brief inspection, I found a thick line wrapped around the prop and shaft. I radioed the supervisor, who then lowered a canvas tool bag for me. I hung the bag from the shaft and got to work freeing the propeller. It didn't take long. When I returned to retrieve my tools, I heard a strange crunching sound as I dropped them into the bag. Looking inside, I found it was full of large shells, many of which I had just crushed without realizing it. After surfacing and stripping off my gear, I took a closer look. The shells had what looked like hieroglyphics etched into them. One of the senior divers told me this wasn't common, but it had happened to several others over the years. Another time, we were assigned to recover a military aircraft. When we arrived on scene, several naval ships were already there, waiting for us to bring the aircraft up. We were briefed quickly. They had lost communication with the pilot and needed us to recover the plane so they could investigate. I was on comms and logs for that dive, monitoring depth and bottom time while communicating with the divers. When they reached the wreck, they reported back that the plane was intact. That caught us all off guard. The supervisor asked how bad the damage was, but the divers clarified it wasn't damaged at all. It was just sitting there on the seafloor, seemingly untouched. Even stranger, the canopy was still sealed. That meant the cockpit had never been opened and the pilot hadn't ejected. But there was no sign of the pilot. We recovered the aircraft and handed it over to the military. We never heard another word about it. I witnessed another strange event while working topside during a planned demolition operation. To understand it, you need to know that one way we track a diver's position is by watching their bubble stream. When a diver breathes in, their helmet's demand regulator supplies air from the umbilical. When they exhale, the air is expelled into the water and rises to the surface as bubbles. By watching these bubbles from topside, you can get a rough idea of where the divers are. On this particular day, we were hundreds of miles from the nearest land and had deployed 2 divers. About an hour into the dive, we noticed something odd. There were 3 distinct bubble streams coming from where the divers were working. At first, we assumed the current might be playing tricks on us. But soon, a 4th stream of bubbles appeared, this one at a distance from the others. It stopped roughly 20 feet away from the divers, near the unknown 3rd stream. We radioed the divers to ask if they could see anything unusual, but they said everything looked normal from their perspective. Then, even from the surface, we heard a blood-curdling screech echoing from the water. And then, total silence. The divers didn't seem too alarmed. Strange sounds underwater are pretty common, and because sound travels so far and fast in water, it's easy to assume the source is far away. But before long, we saw what looked like the water boiling in the distance, and it was moving toward the divers. It wasn't actually boiling. What we were seeing were countless new bubble streams approaching the work site. That's when the supervisor made the call to pull the divers out. They were ordered to get onto the dive stage so we could lift them back to the surface. The bubble streams were frighteningly close by then. As the divers were being brought up, they reported seeing shadowy figures in the distance, but couldn't make out exactly what they were. Given the circumstances, we aborted the mission. We skipped the decompression stops and immediately placed the divers into the hyperbaric chamber for safety. During another dive near the Bahamas, I had one of the most frightening experiences of my career. It was my first salvage job with the company, so I was paired with a highly experienced diver. We were down just over 200 feet, inspecting a sunken vessel to identify potential rigging points. As I approached the bow, I saw my dive partner examining a damaged section of the hull. He swam a few feet inside the wreck, appearing to look around. I asked him several times over comms if he wanted me to tend his umbilical from outside the ship, standard protocol since entering a sunken vessel is dangerous, but he kept replying no, saying he wasn't inside. He insisted he was on the port side of the wreck. Assuming he was confused or disoriented, I reached in to help guide him out. But just before touching him, I noticed something chilling. There were no bubbles coming from his helmet. Whatever this was, it wasn't breathing. I backed away immediately and radioed topside, reporting that there was something else down here. I braced myself for jokes or disbelief, but the response was dead serious. The diving supervisor's voice came over comms. Both divers, square yourselves away and get ready to leave bottom. Once we were back on the surface, I asked him what he thought it was. He simply said that he refuses to put his divers into exceptionally dangerous situations, and then refused to say anything more. We abandoned the salvage. What happened on the next dive is even harder to explain. I was on bottom, lying on my back, staring up into the murky water above. All I could see were different shades of darkness. Suddenly, I became aware of myself, as if waking up mid-dive. I had no memory of how I got there. I couldn't recall entering the water or even the purpose of the dive. I tried to move, but couldn't. My body wouldn't respond. I was completely paralyzed. I could hear topside on the comms, urgently instructing the other diver to find me. How long had I been missing? How long had I been laying there? Then I heard the other diver say, they grabbed him. I tried to shout, to signal in any way, but nothing worked. I was trapped in my own body. A few tense minutes passed, filled with rapid communication between topside and my partner. Then I saw something, a shadow coming into focus, approaching me. Topside, I found him. He reached down and grabbed my harness, beginning to drag me toward the dive stage. As he pulled me, my body rolled slightly, giving me a glimpse of where I'd been laying. It was a pile of human bones. One of the strangest things I've ever witnessed happen during a body recovery mission. Honestly, if I hadn't been the one in the water, I wouldn't have believed it myself. The military had located a site they believed contained the remains of several missing World War II sailors. I was assigned to the dive, paired with another diver, and we were sent down with body bags to recover the remains. Once we reached the seafloor, we eventually discovered 3 skeletons. We carefully placed them into the bags and made our way back to the dive stage for ascent. During our return to the surface, we noticed something disturbing. The body bags started to move. At first, the movement was subtle. Then, suddenly, the bags began to shake violently, twisting and rolling. Bubbles escaped from 2 of them before they went still, but the third bag kept struggling. Once we surfaced, we scrambled onto the deck and tore off our gear in a panic. None of us wanted to touch the bags at first, but one of the tenders eventually stepped forward and unzipped the one that was still moving. An old, frail man, very much alive, rolled out, coughing up seawater. The entire crew stood frozen, stunned by what we were seeing. Without fully understanding what I was doing, I rushed to the other 2 bags and unzipped them. Inside were 2 more elderly men, but they weren't moving. They looked like they had just drowned. We tried CPR, but nothing worked. They were gone. The man who had somehow survived was crawling away from us in terror, screaming about the horrors he had seen. He cried out about an eternity spent burning. In his panic, he lashed out, and we ended up locking him in a room while we contacted the military to report that we had recovered a survivor. Less than an hour later, a military helicopter arrived to collect the bodies and the survivor. We had zipped the bodies back into the bags, ready for handoff. One of the military personnel unzipped a bag to inspect its contents. The moment he did, an unbearable stench filled the air. The bodies now looked badly decayed, like they had been decomposing in the water for a week. He zipped the bags closed and had them loaded onto the helicopter. We then took him to the survivor. From down the hall, we could hear the man's screams. When we opened the door, we saw blood smeared and splattered on the walls. The man was still alive and screaming, but his body now looked like it too had started to rot. Without saying a word, the military officer calmly walked him out and onto the chopper. The two were airlifted away. We never heard about them again. Later, I went back to the room where the man had been kept. Using his own blood, he had drawn symbols all over the walls. I couldn't understand most of them, but a few stood out clearly. Waves, flames, and bodies. Many, many bodies. There were dozens of symbols. But before I could examine them further, our supervisor arrived with a scrub brush and began wiping the walls clean. He refused to let us document or discuss what we had seen. Over the years, I've heard whispers among divers about something called the Keepers of the Deep. Few talk about them openly, but I've pieced together bits of the myth. According to the legend, the deep is not ours to explore. And when a diver dies in the ocean, death may not be the end. Some say these souls are cursed to roam the depths forever. And if they encounter the living, driven by envy, rage, or sorrow, they will drag you down to join them in the place they can never leave. The Keepers of the Deep. I've never found any information about them online. The only people I've ever heard speak about them were the members of my own dive team. Even then, the subject was usually avoided, talked about only in hushed tones, if at all. Still, I've been told that other teams have encountered them too. One experience that stands out happened while we were working on an oil rig. We were using an ROV, a remotely operated vehicle, kind of like a small underwater drone for inspections. The rig crew had reported unusual vibrations, and we've been hired to check for any structural damage or integrity issues. ROVs are tethered by a line that provides power, allows video and sonar transmission, and contains a strength member for durability. As we lowered the ROV into the dark waters below, we started noticing thin scratches along the rig structure. At first, they looked like the kind of marks that might result from marine growth being scraped away. But as the ROV went deeper, those scratches turned into gouges, deep, forceful, and unsettling. Further down, it became clear the marks weren't random. They were deliberate. We brought the ROV in closer to get a better look, and what we saw chilled us. Symbols, hieroglyphics were carved into the metal, and they were fresh, sharp, clean. As we continued descending, the carvings changed. They appeared older, weathered, corroded, and partially obscured by marine life. It was as if whatever had made them was slowly working its way upward from the ocean floor. Then the ROV stopped responding. It began to shake violently, swaying back and forth. Suddenly, we lost power and all data feeds. We attempted to haul it up by the tether, but it wouldn't budge. It felt stuck. Then the line started tugging, but the force wasn't coming from above. It was pulling from the side, deeper into the water. Something had grabbed it. 2 more team members jumped in to help pull the ROV back up, fighting against whatever was down there. The tension on the line was immense. We heard the fiber core creaking under strain until it finally snapped. The line recoiled back in our hands. The ROV was gone. We retrieved the remaining length of tether, but there was nothing left to salvage. The supervisor was left with the unenviable task of figuring out how to report what had just happened to the oil company. No one wanted to write down what we had really seen. One particular incident happened about a year ago during a salvage job. We were in the process of installing rigging gear when it occurred. I was facing the wreck with my back turned to the open ocean, completely unaware of anything approaching. Suddenly, something slammed into the tank on my back, hard. The impact drove me forward, smashing me against the hull of the ship. The force left me stunned and flattened against the metal. I quickly turned around, but there was nothing there. No sign of what hit me. Later, I found out I had several bruised ribs from the hit. I reported the incident to the other diver and to topside. They didn't waste any time. They told us they were pulling us out immediately. We climbed onto the dive stage and began our ascent. As we rose through the water column, we kept our eyes scanning the surrounding shadows, uneasy and on edge. During one of our decompression stops, we began to notice a shape, a dark figure circling us in the water. We tracked its movement as it slowly got closer. As it drew near, the figure became clearer. It was a massive shark. Now, I've never been afraid of sharks, but there's something about being circled by a giant predator deep in the open ocean while standing exposed on a suspended platform that can make even the toughest men develop a new phobia. Unlike the safety of a dive cage, the stage offered no protection. It felt like we were being served up on a silver platter. The shark continued circling, getting closer each time. Eventually, it came close enough that we could see its features in detail, and none of us recognized the species. It was larger than a great white, but the coloration was all wrong. Its body was mostly black, with some gray accents, and it watched us the entire time. We stayed frozen, helpless, hoping it would lose interest. By the time we finished our decompression, the shark was nearly within arm's reach. But just as tension peaked, the stage lifted us out of the water. We surfaced, shaken but unharmed, relieved the shark hadn't decided to find out what we tasted like. Later, after examining my gear, we concluded that whatever had hit me must have been the shark. It had lunged at me from behind, but instead of biting, it struck the emergency gas supply cylinder on my back. We had another dive recently, this time in crystal clear waters. And there's something comforting about being able to actually see your surroundings underwater. Visibility was incredible, well over 100 feet. Once we reached the bottom, we began our task. The job involved locating and recovering 2 missiles that had been ejected from a military aircraft but hadn't detonated. We were thoroughly briefed beforehand. The missiles were unarmed and would not detonate as long as we followed proper handling procedures. We found them much more quickly than expected and began prepping them for rigging. I was just laying my hands on the first missile when my dive buddy suddenly said, "Oh shit!" My stomach dropped instantly. It doesn't matter how many times you've worked around ordnance. There's always a knot in your gut and a nervous tick in the back of your mind. But when I looked up, I realized he wasn't reacting to the missile. He was staring at a wall of sand rising in the distance. Something, hopefully just a shift in the current, was kicking up a massive cloud of sand from the ocean floor. The wall kept growing, easily reaching 30 feet high, and it was moving toward us fast. And then it hit us. It's hard to describe just how disorienting bad visibility underwater can be. It's not about a lack of light. It's about the water being so full of particles that no light can penetrate it. Imagine fog, but thicker than anything you've ever experienced. The kind of fog where someone could hold a flashlight right in front of your face and you still wouldn't see it. That's what hit us. The moment that wall of sand engulfed us, we were plunged into total darkness. I put my hand against my faceplate and couldn't even see that. Then we heard it, a metallic scraping sound, slow, uneasy, and just as suddenly as it had arrived, the sand cleared. Visibility returned. The waters were crystal clear again. But the missiles were gone. I had been within arm's reach of one of them when the sand hit, but now there was no trace. Even feeling around in the disturbed sand revealed nothing. It was as if they had vanished entirely. The next incident happened during a humanitarian mission we volunteered for. A portion of a bridge had collapsed into 50-foot deep ocean water, and we offered to help recover the vehicles and hopefully the bodies. By the time we arrived on site, the collapse had happened just over a week prior. We spent the first day surveying the area and creating a plan to recover as many vehicles as we could in the 1-week window we had. By the second day, we were actively hauling cars off the seabed. It was a challenging job, but not because of the physical effort. What made it hard was the emotional toll. These weren't lost sailors or military pilots. These were families, people on vacation, or just commuting to work. It's difficult to say what was worse, finding a car where the parents had unbuckled their seatbelts and were in the back, desperately trying to free their children, or the cars where the parents had escaped, leaving their kids still strapped in the back seats. I tried not to imagine the panic, the water rushing in through shattered windshields and windows, the desperate struggle to escape. But the images were hard to push away, and I couldn't help but feel a deep anger toward those who had abandoned their families. Each day, we cleared a new section of vehicles. On the fourth day, something changed. We began finding cars with the doors already open and no one inside. At first, it seemed like a good thing. Maybe people had escaped. Maybe there had been fewer casualties than we feared. That was until I began rigging a minivan for extraction. There was a family inside. They hadn't escaped. As I worked threading the slings into place, I noticed the other diver inspecting the rigging. He was undoing one of the shackles I had secured. I asked him what he was doing. His answer made my blood run cold. "I'm checking this truck for bodies." That sinking feeling returned to my gut. Slowly, I swam over to him and gently turned his body toward me. It resisted, unnaturally, but I managed to turn him. His faceplate was fogged up, but I leaned in closer against my better judgment. I wish I hadn't. The features were unmistakable, rotting flesh. The person inside that helmet had been dead for a long time. Panic overtook me. I began screaming into my comms, but I don't think I even heard the voices from topside or the other divers. All I could focus on was getting away. In my frantic retreat, I'd tangled my umbilical around the rigging gear. I fought to free myself as the thing turned its attention back to the minivan. That's when I noticed it again, the absence of bubbles from its helmet. No breathing, no life. It reached for the van's door and opened it. I could only watch in horror as it grabbed one of the passengers and dragged the body into the dark. That moment broke something in me. It was the first time I admitted to myself that maybe I wasn't cut out for this life under the sea. I kept diving for longer than I should have, but from then on, the thought never left my mind. I need to find a safer career. After I started sharing these stories online, I was contacted by my old dive supervisor. He warned me about the risks of making this kind of information public. But then, his tone shifted. "Things are getting worse down there," he said. He had never spoken this openly with me before. But he didn't stop there. We had an incident last week, and we lost men. I was stunned. We all understand the dangers of the job. And yes, we've all had encounters, brushes with the keepers of the deep, but no one really expects to die. After a few close calls, you start to believe you'll always just have another close call. He went on, "Out of respect for our fallen, you need to use your best judgment before sharing this. And understand, it's not safe to talk about." Then he told me what happened. Their team had been called in for a routine military salvage operation. From the start, the details were vague. All they were told was that a vessel had gone down and the Navy needed assistance. The team and all their gear were loaded onto a U.S. naval ship which would escort them to the site. That kind of deployment is rare, but not entirely unusual. But as they traveled to the project location, things grew increasingly strange. First, the commanding officer of the ship personally delivered the initial briefing. He went over their confidentiality agreements and reminded them of the seriousness of their work. Then he handed the briefing over to a man who never gave his name. The man explained that the Navy had been working on a prototype submarine. He made it clear that the details of the sub, its technology, design, and capabilities were irrelevant to the dive team. All they needed to know was that it was enormous, far larger than any submarine they had ever seen. Then he clarified the real reason they were there. This wasn't routine salvage. 4 days earlier, the Navy had lost all contact with the crew aboard the prototype. Sonar scans showed the sub sitting on the seafloor, apparently intact. But no one was responding. No distress signals, no pings, nothing. That's when the Navy called them in, not to recover equipment, but to find out what had happened on board. As the ship arrived on site, it became immediately clear they weren't alone. Nearly a dozen Navy vessels were already in position, waiting for their arrival. The dive team was given the green light to enter the water and begin operations. Their first task was to inspect the submarine for any damage or hazards. Before any recovery efforts could begin, they needed to provide a comprehensive bottom report to the engineers, who would then formulate a precise plan to raise the sub. This wasn't a job where they could just rig it however they saw fit. This prototype needed to be recovered in as close to pristine condition as possible. The divers entered the water and were immediately awestruck by what they saw. The submarine was unlike anything they'd ever encountered. It was enormous. From their descent point, they couldn't even see the forward or aft ends. The visibility was unusually clear, unnaturally so. The sub's hull was constructed from a reflective metal that appeared to be woven into overlapping scales, giving it an almost organic look. The divers began their inspection for damage, scanning the hull as they moved along. After reaching their maximum allowable bottom time, the first team surfaced without incident. They reported to the next team that they had inspected from midship to the aft section and found no damage. In fact, the submarine appeared to have settled gently onto the seabed, with no signs of impact or distress. The second dive team entered the water to inspect the midship forward. As they advanced, scanning for damage, one of the divers tapped on the hull out of habit. That's when everything changed. Immediately, both divers reported hearing sounds from inside, banging against the hull and muffled shouting. They couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Panic, fear. The crew inside the submarine was still alive. The supervisor relayed the discovery to command. There was evidence of life aboard the prototype. The divers pushed forward. About 5 minutes later, they sent another update, this time reporting something far stranger. Carvings. The metallic scales covering the submarine's surface had been etched with symbols, hieroglyphics, stretching from the bow toward the midship. Despite the carvings, there were still no visible signs of structural failure. Nothing explained why the submarine had lost all contact. The divers returned to the surface, and a full report of the day's findings was delivered to the commanding officer. The team was assured that the submarine was still capable of supporting its crew. While the situation was unusual, command seemed eager to recover the vessel. They believed the crew was in relatively little danger and time was on their side. As day 2 began, a new team of divers descended with specific instructions: locate 4 key structural points that engineers had marked for rigging. These needed to be confirmed as structurally sound before any attempt to lift the submarine could be made. Almost immediately after reaching the sub, the divers reported the same thing as the previous team: persistent banging from inside. The noise hadn't stopped. If anything, it was more urgent. The divers pressed on and quickly located the first 2 rigging points. As they approached the forward section of the submarine, just within the portion of the hull covered in carvings, they both spotted movement. A figure. There was no doubt about it. Both divers saw it. Something was moving around the exterior of the sub. But just as quickly as it appeared, it vanished into the shadows. They scanned the area thoroughly, but it was simply gone. Not wanting to waste time, they decided to locate the final 2 rigging points and complete their objective. It didn't take long. Both remaining points were intact and suitable for use. With their primary task complete, they began to prepare for ascent. Then a new directive came through comms. The engineers had requested that the divers locate and inspect 2 additional features on the submarine. Hatches located on the port and starboard sides. The supervisor's voice came through with hesitation. The engineers up here got uneasy when they heard your report of movement. They went into a briefing room, and when they came out, they were adamant, you need to find and inspect those hatches. They won't explain why. Please be cautious. The divers returned to the forward section and began methodically examining the hull more closely. Then something happened. They spotted movement again, this time clearer. A figure was emerging from the submarine. It was dragging a body, frozen in place. The divers watched as the figure pulled the limp form from a hatch, then silently pushed the hatch closed and began dragging the body off into the murky distance. Stunned, the divers swam to the location. It took a moment, but they found the hatch. It blended nearly perfectly with the submarine's scaled, carved surface. But it was there. As they began reporting their discovery to topside, the hatch creaked, and slowly, it began to open again. Topside suddenly lost all communications with the 2 divers. Panic erupted on deck. The tenders reported tension on both umbilicals, sharp, unnatural strain. Something was pulling on them hard. The standby diver quickly suited up, donning his helmet, visibly shaken but prepared to enter the water. Before he could get in, the tension on the umbilicals peaked. They began violently jerking and shaking, whipping through the water. Then, just as suddenly, the strain vanished. The lines went limp, trailing listlessly beneath the surface. Moments later, a violent eruption of air bubbles broke the surface, sending a chill through everyone watching. That's when the supervisor grabbed the standby diver and gave a single urgent order. Get the divers and get the fuck out of there. The diver entered the water, following the umbilicals down in a desperate search to locate his teammates. As he descended, he passed through streams of violently rising air, evidence of a breach somewhere below. He followed the umbilicals deeper until he reached their source. What he found made his blood run cold. Both umbilicals had been severed, their ends pumping air uselessly into the water. The divers were completely cut off. Now in a race against time, he frantically searched the surrounding area, hoping against hope to find them alive. After 5 long minutes, he had found nothing. Then a new order came through comms. Inspect the hatch. He swam with purpose, desperate, toward the location where the hatch had last been seen. It was open. Inside, on the floor of the compartment, were the 2 divers, motionless. He entered the space, determined to retrieve them. But then, out of the dim shadows surrounding the room, he saw movement. Figures, several of them, lurking in the darkness. He grabbed the nearest body and began dragging it toward the exit, but before he could escape, the figures rushed him. They were on him instantly, clawing at him, tearing at his gear. In a panic, he let go of the body and fought to free himself. Kicking and clawing his way out, he managed to escape the compartment and shot upward, ascending far too fast. Topside pulled him from the water, unconscious and bleeding. He lay motionless on the deck, the signs of a rapid, uncontrolled ascent clear, most likely an arterial gas embolism. The crew rushed to stabilize him and immediately transferred him into the hyperbaric chamber for emergency treatment. The supervisor informed the commanding officer that all diving operations were being terminated immediately. He had already lost 2 men, and 1 more was in critical condition. There were things happening on that submarine that defied explanation, and he wasn't willing to sacrifice any more lives. Treatment for the injured diver continued throughout the night. Eventually, he regained consciousness. When the supervisor came to check on him, the diver was clear. He was done. He would never enter the water again. The supervisor assured him that no one else would be diving either, and that once his treatment was complete, the entire team would be returning to land. But the next morning, the team was summoned for what they assumed would be a debriefing. They entered the meeting room, where the commanding officer and his engineering team were waiting. The CO asked them to take a seat. Then he gave them unexpected news. The Navy would not be moving forward with salvaging the prototype submarine. However, whatever was inside the sub, it couldn't be left there. It had to be destroyed. The CO explained that charges needed to be planted at specific locations as directed by the engineering team. The salvage team was being ordered to carry out the demolition. The supervisor was livid. He demanded that his crew be returned to the mainland immediately and released from duty. That's when armed sentries entered the room. They restrained him without hesitation. The CO restated his orders and made it clear no one was leaving until the job was finished. Back on dive side, the atmosphere was grim. Several armed sailors watched over the crew as preparations were made. The supervisor continued to protest, refusing to participate in the operation. After more than an hour of tense conflict, 2 divers reluctantly agreed, under duress, to enter the water and plant the explosives. Fearfully, they descended. As they reached the designated points and began placing the charges, the familiar sounds returned, banging from inside the sub, muffled voices shouting. The realization hit them hard. People were still alive in there. The divers broke down, sobbing underwater. They understood what was about to happen. Then the CO's voice came over comms, cold and steady. "This will be over soon. The mission must be completed. You will not be released until it is." Eventually, the divers composed themselves and carried on. Once the charges were planted, they returned to the surface. They were silent, ashamed. Neither spoke a word as they left dive side. Soon after, the fleet began to disperse. The team was summoned once more. The commanding officer stood before them, expression unreadable. He thanked them for their service to the nation and assured them they would be well compensated for the regrettable tragedy they had endured. Then came the final warning. He reminded them of their confidentiality agreements and stressed the importance of silence. "Previous incidents have been leaked," he said. "Understand that there will be real consequences if anything about today is shared." My supervisor ended the conversation with a quiet confession. The entire team had agreed. They were leaving the diving company for good. The fear of what lay beneath the ocean and the guilt from what they had done were too heavy to carry. There are some places, he told me, that man simply isn't meant to explore.